Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar about the Stanford Biodesign Innovation Fellowship. My name is Emily Johnson, and I am the Fellowships Manager here at Stanford Biodesign. It's great to have you here from wherever you're joining us in the world, and we're so happy to have you. As you're popping on, would you help us answer the two survey questions that appear on the sidebar of your screen? That will help us figure out where you heard about the webinar and how you heard about the fellowship itself. So thank you in advance for filling out those two survey questions. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. James Waugh, Director of Development of the Innovation Fellowship. Dr. Waugh is an assistant professor of pediatric surgery at Stanford, a successful entrepreneur and former biodesign alum himself. And joining him is Dr. Sandra Ruggles, one of our assistant directors of the Innovation Fellowship. Sandy is also a fellowship alum with a PhD in biophysics, an expert level strategic marketing and product development experience, and president of Summit Rock Strategy Consulting. Today we'll be talking about what the Innovation Fellowship is all about, what you'll learn, the biodesign process, and what you can expect from the program. We'll save some time at the end for live Q&A at the end of the webinar. So if you want to just use the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen dashboard there, you can submit your questions throughout the webinar, and we will try to answer as many as we can at the end. Just a reminder, please also join us for our second webinar later this summer that will feature 4 fellowship alumni that can speak more to the actual experience of being a fellow, where their careers were before the fellowship and where they took them after. So that will be on July 11th at 5 p.m. and you can register for that on our website. So again, welcome. And with that, I'm happy to turn the time over to Dr. Waugh and Dr. Ruggles.
Thanks, Emily. So I'm James Waugh, the co-director of the Innovation Fellowship, and myself and Sandy are going to talk to you today about the fellowship from our perspective and share with you a general sense of what the program looks to accomplish, the type of people we look to recruit, and ultimately what it looks like to be a biodesign fellow. So I'm going to start by actually taking a little step back and talking about what the biodesign program is all about so that you can get a context of then what the fellowship itself is. So the overall mission of our center, which is beyond just the fellowship, is to develop leaders in health technology innovation. And this is really important because we are fundamentally an educational program. We're housed at Stanford University, and our goal is to develop individuals and educate individuals. There are many other things that we talk about in terms of the technologies we produce, some of them turning into companies and even being financially successful. But at the core of it, what we really want to do is develop individuals to give them the tools, the network, and the skills to be health technology innovators. So how do we do that as a center? Well, one thing is simply where we're located. Stanford's clearly one of the leading universities in the country. We're in the heart of Silicon Valley, where innovation is ripe. And even specifically within the Stanford campus, when you look at biodesign, we are parked literally in between the schools of medicine and engineering, with the design schools nearby, as well as the business school. And we really try and tap into all of these areas of expertise to develop fully rounded individuals who can go out and become really impactful in health technology. When you look at our audiences, again, just to give you the context, while the fellowship is the cornerstone of what we do and really the flagship program, we also, in addition to the fellowship, do many courses. We teach in different areas of innovation, from mobile health to fundamentals. We teach from undergraduate all the way through faculty, as well as we teach external executives through an executive education course. We have grant programs within the university that help to fund some projects that come out of all of these different courses and opportunities. And we also have multiple global initiatives, including partnerships with Singapore, Japan, Ireland, India, and beyond. And finally, as I did mention already, we have an executive education course where we as faculty and our fellows are involved in both in the education of external executives in health technology. Oh, excuse me, went one too far. So The results have been impressive. Again, this is not our primary outcome or goal, but when you look at what the program's been able to produce over its first 18 years, and this will be the 19th class coming in, we've graduated 227 fellows to date, and really touched thousands of people in terms of our undergraduate, graduate, faculty, and executive education. The result of this has been devices that have been developed within our programs touching over 2.7 million patients. And that has been through a combination of licensing, startups, and other methodologies that you would learn if you came to the program. So that gives you the context of the overall program. Our goal is developing individuals who become health technology innovation leaders. And let's now talk specifically about the fellowship. So the fellowship is a full-time postdoctoral program. It comes with a stipend. We pay you, you don't pay us. It is not a master's program. It's not a PhD program. And again, it is full-time, so it is not something that's done on nights and weekends, and it can't be done in conjunction with a full-time job or any other commitments. We do expect a full-time commitment for the 9 to 10 months of the fellowship. What the fellowship looks like is really captured in this image. We put together 4 innovation teams of individuals from different backgrounds, both educationally, culturally, and experientially. We also look for certain skill sets in terms of creativity and organization to put together teams that can really function at a high level. This is an example of a biodesign innovation team from 2 years ago, where we have a physician on the left, an interventional radiologist, a mechanical engineer, second from the left of the screen, engineer with an MBA and business background with operating experience in med tech to the back of the screen, and then another physician who was a nephrologist to the far right. So you can see we put together teams where you have combination of skill sets, very diverse backgrounds in terms of education and experience. The goal of putting these teams together is to give you a project-based experience. This is, again, is not a master's where we're doing quarterly work. This is not primarily didactic. This is project-based. So what we want to teach you is a repeatable methodology for healthcare innovation, and really teach you the fundamentals of how you can potentially implement these innovations in the real world and get them out to real patients. In terms of just to give you a little background on who you'd be working with and who the kind of the management structure of biodesign, my co-director is Dr. Dan Ezaguri. He's a practicing general adult surgeon, minimally invasive surgeon, and bariatric surgeon. He's also the co-founder of a company named CL that had a recent acquisition, and that came out of the biodesign program where he was a fellow about 8 years ago. Lynn Denon is our director for academic programs. She comes from a very strong background of educational operations, starting in the business school, and we were fortunate enough to get her over to biodesign a number of years ago. You already met Emily Johnson, who's the fellowship manager, and she's the primary point of contact for all things fellowship, and will probably be the one answering most of the questions at the end today. Extending the leadership team, we have Doug Raitt, who's one of our other co-directors. He is a trained psychologist who does team learning and design thinking. What we found is that when we put together these high-powered teams that you saw in the image earlier, and we create a flat hierarchy where tough decisions have to be made on real-world projects, we really need to manage the team's function, and Doug has been our resident expert in doing that for the last 5 years. We're really lucky this year to have 3 new assistant directors for the program. Kate Garrett, who has a background in engineering and was a co-founder of CL with Dan. Vic McCrae, who's a practicing general surgeon in a small portion of his time, but primarily is the CEO of a company named Tangible that also came out of the biodesign program. And Sandy, who you heard about from the introduction from Emily, who's on the call with us today, and will be discussing a part of the program once we get through my first section here. Finally, we have an incredible network of adjunct faculty and extended faculty. Gordon Sull and Uday Kumar both incredibly successful in their own rights in both venture capital and business, are in charge of the implementation team, which really teaches about once you've got a concept and a strategy, how you can really get something from prototype to market and market success ultimately. Jan Peach and Cynthia Yock lead our value-based modules, which is becoming increasingly more important in healthcare these days to have a real justifiable value claim as you're trying to innovate within the healthcare market. And then finally, engineering and creativity. We have Ross Vanook and Farzad Azimpour. Ross is a multiple award winner in education at Stanford for his teaching and engineering, and Farzad's a former IDEO director and currently with his own startup who brings a wealth of engineering and creativity and brainstorming talent to the table. Finally, we have a global faculty that I won't go into too much detail. This program does tend to focus on innovation within the US market because that's where we're based. However, more and more we're seeing that innovative products have plays in global markets if you understand them. And we have a wealth of knowledge spanning the globe in terms of global implementation. And finally, we have an incredible staff of people who really support the program from the financial standpoint, from marketing, and from day-to-day operations. And lastly, the really extended network that's critical to the fellowship. We bring in real world operators. These are 4 of the best that exist in Silicon Valley in health technology to come in and mentor the teams one-on-one, as well as provide overall support. So Lisa, Bev, and Maria are all serially successful. They've all worked as CEOs of startups as well as within larger corporations, and they provide incredible insights as projects move forward. And Hanson Gifford is really a legend in the Valley, part of the foundry that's been responsible for the creation of multiple successful technologies, and he meets with the teams on a regular basis as well. So let's talk about the program and really our approach. So most people, if you're interested in innovation, you've heard of design thinking. Design thinking is not new, but what we have done at Biodesign is really try and modulate and focus design thinking on healthcare and healthcare needs. So where most people talk about empathy or understanding the customer, we really talk about clinical immersion. In terms of the need, we talk about really characterizing the need from multiple standpoints, and then ultimately moving on to ideation, prototyping, and testing. The reason it's important to cater this to the healthcare system is that you don't have a single user as you would with a consumer product. You've really got at least an 8-headed monster. You've got payers who really what it comes down to is you have a separation of 3 different issues. You have the user as one potential player, you have the payer who can be completely different, and the beneficiary, often the patient. So you've got 3 potential decision points and a lot of roadblocks. So again, to make that point, you've also got politics added on top of it, regulatory bodies. So healthcare is undoubtedly more complex than standard consumer, and you have to understand a lot of that stuff as you navigate the waters of innovation. And the more you understand early in the process, we believe you can make better decisions on projects that have real opportunity to impact patients. So we take design thinking and we turn it into what we call the 3 I's of the biodesign process: identify, invent, and implement. To be clear, the fellowship really focuses most heavily on identification and invention. We then begin the process of implementation, but implementing a healthcare technology simply takes more than a few months at the end of a fellowship. And by implement, I mean truly getting it to patient care and sustainability. So I'm going to talk about the identification portion of the process, and then I'm going to hand over to Sandy to talk about invention and implementation. And before we actually touch on the process, I just want to point out some of the teams from this year to give everyone a sense of the talent that we are looking for and generally looking to recruit. We had multiple teams. Top team, we had an ER physician, critical care physician, mechanical engineer with an industry background, and a real design thinking expert. The second team, we had a neonatologist, mechanical engineer, and two people with deep industry experience, one at a large corporate, one at a startup. And the final team, we had a cardiologist, ENT surgeon, and again, two individuals with deep medtech experience, one more corporate, one more on the startup and design side. So here's the overall experience start to finish. We'll talk about first what we do before we even get into the true process of biodesign is a boot camp. So the first 2 weeks that you're at Stanford, we really do have a more didactic approach. We do a quick mini project so that you can always apply your knowledge to something that's real. And we focus on one area of interest for the year, meaning one clinical area. Over the years, we've done everything from cardiology to orthopedics to OBGYN, and we will make that announcement closer to the start of the fellowship as to exactly what we're doing next year. So the boot camp allows us to connect the fellows with faculty members in that area of clinical interest. It then allows us to share some initial teaching on some fundamentals that everybody needs to understand, such as IP, regulatory issues, etc. And then it allows people to begin to apply that early knowledge base to what we call kind of a quick boot camp project. This is a pretty intense period. It's really didactics for most of the daytime period, and the teams work together on their mini projects a lot at nights and weekends. So that first 2 weeks is a pretty intense period. We then move on from those mini projects and take that early learning into clinical immersion. This is absolutely one of the highlights that our fellows always talk about from the program. We do have open access to Stanford University Hospital, Lucile Packard Children's Hospital, and many of our adjunct facilities in the Bay Area. The open door policy, we do obviously expect respect and professional courtesy for the physicians that you work with. But essentially, once you've begun to work with them and arrange meetings and observations, you have access to clinics, operating rooms, and really anywhere where patient care happens. We believe this is really critical. It's not easy for us to gain this access, but we've built the trust of clinicians to do this over the years. And it's this primary observation where you get to see the problem firsthand and interpret what the physicians are telling you in order to determine where there's opportunity in healthcare. From immersion, we expect after about a 6-week period, teams to come up with several hundred needs. I won't go into too much of the teaching on needs here, but essentially for every observation where a clinician's struggling or a patient outcome doesn't go well, or there's an opportunity to relieve pain, etc., we ask fellows to convert that into a need statement so that they can really catalog what they've seen in observations and then begin to work on those needs and understand where a great opportunity may be. And in simple form, a need statement, we ask people to understand what the problem is, what the population of patients it's applicable to, and what outcome you'd have to change in order to really make a difference. So this is typically what our fellows will come up with, is a large database of needs. We then ask them to really focus on validating those needs. So observing something is one thing, but understanding if it's a one-off problem at a university hospital for a rare patient versus a very common problem that may be ubiquitous across all 8,000 hospitals in the country, or all patients with diabetes, et cetera, is really important. So this is where you have to start going deep and learning about the patients and the practice patterns. Not all of this information is Googleable. We certainly teach you how to go through medical literature, how to do additional interviews with providers and patients of different backgrounds, but really trying to understand the scope of the problem is really critical here. We take those sort of initial 200 needs and we kind of go through a process of screening. Obviously, you can't go super deep on 200. So we have people do an initial understanding of overall clinical impact and other filters that brings them down to 80 needs. We then get them to go more to some top level data. Once they get down to about 24 needs, we ask them to go deeper. etc. As we get to 8 needs, they really start brainstorming and developing concepts. And at that stage, we then ask them to go down to really the final 4 towards the February timeframe. And ultimately, by the end of the year, which the fellowship projects end in around April and May, we'll be down to 1 or 2 fully fleshed out projects that have a deep understanding of the need, the market, and a concept that can go on to prototyping and implementation. Some of the things that we look at, just as an example of how we get through that process of drilling down on needs, we tend to really focus before you've ever come up with a concept. So really, truly at the needs phase, before anyone's decided we're going to do a mobile app or an implantable device. What drives this need and what makes it a valuable opportunity? Market size certainly matters. That can be judged by dollars or number of patients. Treatment landscape really matters. Is there a lot of competitive products, or is there really a white space? And then ultimately, what we're all really driven by, patient impact. Can we really move the needle on mortality, morbidity, suffering, etc.? As we move on through excuse me, concepts, we also look at filtering through market pathways. What's the easiest way to get to the patients? We look at impact on payers, which is where our value and health economics team is incredibly valuable. And of course, we have to touch on intellectual property once we get into concepts and understand the role of patentability and freedom to operate for any concept that could potentially move forward. So I'm going to turn it over now to Sandy to talk about, so what I just really summarized was the overall biodesign center, our mission of training the next generation of health tech innovators, and then talked about what the fellowship looks like and the identification portion of the process, which we really focus a lot on. That takes about 4 months of the year just to identify the right project to work on. Once you've gotten to that point, it gets really fun, and Sandy's going to talk about how we go on to invention and implementation.
Great. All right. Thanks, James. Can you hear me? I see you're still held as the primary speaker.
I can hear you, and I think...
okay.
Yep.
Okay. Good. All right. So now I know you're controlling the slides. So we're going to talk here a little bit about brainstorming, concept generation, and prototyping. So if you go to the next slide, James. So at Biodesign, as you saw, we're located very close to the engineering school, and you have access to some incredible resources, both through the design school that is located on the other side of campus, as well as what's called the PRL, the Product Realization Laboratory. There's a number of TAs there that can help you take your initial concept and put it into a form that allows you to test it with potential users and really try to get to a proof of concept. We also have, as James mentioned earlier, Ross Vanook. He's in the red shirt in this picture, who is a fantastic resource for our fellows, as well as the Biodesign CoLab, which is a lab located right near Biodesign where you can work on prototyping and creating your concepts. So let's go to the next slide. So while you are going through and generating concepts, and we actually ask each of the teams to generate multiple concepts that will solve the needs that they have identified, as a fellow and a fellow team, you're also going to be screening your concepts against how well they fit into the market and the market opportunity that you've identified. So you see here an example of how you might simply score some of the concepts that you come up with that solve your need between feasibility, IP here, and the freedom to operate, that's FTO. Around your business model, so how the product would generate revenue, and how how risky that business model is with regards to the opportunity and the impact that the product could provide. We also teach you to screen against the regulatory pathway, as well as the reimbursement or payment model that you would be looking at. All of this language becomes easier as you move through the fellowship, and it's part of the reason that we introduce it at the beginning and then have experts who will bring it back and reintroduce it to you as you enter the invent and implement phases of the fellowship. So go to the next slide, James. Great. So as you move forward, the other element of this is really putting together a business plan and continuing to put together your plan for product development. That is a number of different steps, including market validation, functional testing, any ideas around qualification, your clinical trials strategy, and eventual commercialization. So remember, as James said, this isn't something where you're going to be able to get through all these steps in the fellowship year. But the intent of the fellowship is to help you put together a framework for how that product could come to market, and to help you think through many of the different fundamental issues so that it can be as potentially successful as possible. Let's go to the next slide. Right, so should it be something that you want to go forward with, there is that last step of implementation, which is startup formation, with regards to pulling together the resources necessary and introductions to venture capitalists and other funders for early stage products. So you want to go to the next slide. Great. The last thing to talk about here is the final element of the fellowship year. So as James alluded to, your final presentations happen about the end of April. And the fellowship is set up to have a customization period during the last 5 weeks. And you can do a number of different things with this customization period. Most fellows are using it as an opportunity to do an externship, to spend some time with companies both within the Bay Area, but also all across the US and the globe, to get some experience in things like venture capital, in design, like going to IDEO, or getting some experience at startup companies or large cap medical device companies in the area. Typically, this is where you're going to be asked to bring your biodesign experience to a problem or a project that the team at your externship company is working on. So it's intended to be an experience that complements each of your career goals and is fully focused on something that is going to help move you forward. There is also an opportunity to stay and work on your project if you want to do that as well. So let's go to the next slide. So the Biodesign Fellowship is an intense program. It takes a significant commitment of time, and it is a full-time role, but we also believe in really getting the fellows together and encouraging a lot of fun and camaraderie amongst the fellowship years each year. As well, we have a really significant alumni association that hosts social events, so that the fellows can get to know the larger biodesign community throughout their year at Stanford. So because the most important part of this, James, if you go to the next slide, is Biodesign firmly believes that our product is the people and the community that we build through the fellowship program. And so that by far is the most important element of this. And as you fundamentally can hear us saying, this is an educational opportunity at first and foremost. And then beyond that, should you decide to take a project forward into a startup, then we applaud that. But that's the people are really who we want to focus on here. So let's go ahead to the next slide. Great, so that's it. So right now, I'll hand it back to Emily to help us curate some of the Q&A.
Great, thank you, James and Sandy, for that great presentation. If you're watching and you have a question, please go ahead and type that into the Q&A tool down at the bottom of your screen. That's how we'll take questions not in the chat or with the hand raise, but down at the Q&A tool, that'd be great. And we'll spend several minutes on live Q&A. It's a great chance to get your questions answered from our directors here. Anything you'd like to know about the process or applying or things like that. So please don't be shy. Type up your questions and we'll try to get to them as soon as we can.
All right, so I've got a couple that I'm going to take kind of in real time here that I'm seeing. So I don't know if everyone on the webinar can see some of these questions, but I'm going to kind of go through them one by one and answer what we can. So first one is someone who's recommenders. I assume the people writing letters asked if there was additional guidance beyond our Q&A. I would say, no, we want to know what the recommenders genuinely think of their interactions with you. I think focusing on projects that you've worked on together, your ability to work in a team, creativity and skills are always a positive because those are really qualities that we look for in biodesign. A second question is on, is the program hardware focused or could we develop mobile and software solutions? It's a really good question. Our program has evolved over the years. At the start, if you look at what was coming out of the program, it was very hardware, medical device focused. However, starting about 6 years ago, we began to see our fellows really seeing opportunity in the use of software and mobile applications. So the answer is absolutely. Developing mobile and software solutions, if it meets the need and fits all of the criteria, is possible within the program. And we've had quite a few recent successes in people developing software and software plus device, so kind of software hardware combos that really address the unmet needs. In terms of the stipend, we pay a postdoc stipend that's in the range of about $60,000. The exact number will be figured out and offered on the offer letter once we get to that point, but it's in that range. And Emily, please correct me on any of these if you want to jump in. Question about international, person from India, welcome and thank you for coming at this time. Are you eligible? Absolutely. We really encourage global applications. We've had many global fellows. My co-director, Dr. Azaguri, is Swiss and trained in Switzerland, came over for the Biodesign Fellowship and is now on faculty. But we typically have multiple global fellows per year. Someone else asked about collaboration with Singapore, India. In terms of the fellowship itself, the collaboration is really more of meeting on a few times a year. There's opportunities to meet with international fellows, and it's not necessarily Singapore, India. It can also be Ireland and others. We set up times for fellows to meet and sort of share best practices and stories and discuss how an opportunity being developed in one part of the world may or may not apply to another. The interaction is not on a regular cadence, and it's not a core part of our fellowship, but it is an opportunity to meet with people doing similar things around the world. And then if that's of interest, you can kind of leverage those relationships at a later date. All right, I'm going to keep moving through. There's quite a few here. All right. Question about how much industry experience is needed. There's no minimum, but we typically, for someone with an engineering or a business background, we typically see people applying that have somewhere in the range of 2 to 5 years of experience. So just enough, early career, still very motivated to kind of, expand their career options by doing this fellowship, but have some experience that they can bring to the table and offer their team. There's a question about a specific degree within India. I'd have to look into that. If it's a degree specifically in surgery and medicine, I think it would be reasonable. But I'd be happy to, I think that's one that we might want to take offline and follow up with an email. Age range for candidates? Nope, we're open to all ages of candidates. It's really about the combination of having motivation, desire to really work in health technology to make a difference, and then having the level of education and experience that we're looking for. There's a question about whether you get to choose your own project or you're given a theme. That's a really good question and really fundamental to what we do at Biodesign. You are taught how to pick a meaningful project. So every decision made along the way is the decision of you and your team in collaboration. You're never told by faculty members, you should work on this or that. We always give guidance on, this is how we evaluate an opportunity. These are the roadblocks and barriers you may or may not face. But again, the decisions on which projects, how you go from 200 to 80 needs to 4, and then which one, if you want to take one forward, is completely up to you and your team. What we don't encourage is for you to bring a project to the program. That's not the point. The point is not to bring a project and develop it here. The point is to come in, access our resources, our ability to give you access to the clinical settings, develop projects, and then learn how to make the right decisions for the best opportunity. To answer sort of a secondary question there, does the project have to be within the theme of the year? The answer is no. The decision's completely up to the team. The reason we pick a theme is because all of medicine is a little bit of a daunting thing to go out and find needs in. And we find that when we pick a specific area and a faculty who you can interact with, it really accelerates the ability to make those clinical observations. However, if you're, and this has happened many times in our program, if you're observing an operation in orthopedics and you observe a need in anesthesia and want to go down and work on that, it's absolutely fair game to do that, but it does require you doing the same amount of diligence and validation as anything else. Sandy, do you want to jump in at any point if there's any that you see? I'm also happy to continue going, but I don't want to kind of totally dominate the conversation here. If there's any that you have picked out that you think are good to answer.
Yeah, I mean, I can just take the next two if you want. So there's one about being an undergraduate who's just finished an engineering degree with a considerable background in med devices. There isn't a basic qualification in this program for a particular amount of work experience or particular degree programs, but what we are looking for is demonstrated innovation and excitement and focus around developing solutions to healthcare technologies. And so we do want to see in your application that you have an interest in this and a continuation of moving it forward. As James said, on the engineering side, we tend to see people who have a certain amount of work experience and come with backgrounds where they do have that kind of work experience. But I think you're just as competitive if you have some meaningful projects out of your degree programs.
Thanks, Sandy. And then I can touch on...
I guess I sort of answered two of those in a row.
That's good. Yeah, that's excellent. There's a specific visa question about Canadians, but regardless of the country of origin. We typically do H or J visas depending on the candidate. We have had experience with it. We do have one of the specific members of our staff, Carolyn Heller, who you saw there, is in charge of that, and we could certainly provide some information on that if you want to follow up with an email. But typically they're educational visas. They do require full-time work at Stanford and don't allow for additional work outside of the postdoctoral fellowship.
Being on a visa can also affect where you do your externship, so it's important to be mindful of that, to think ahead depending on the requirements, if you're allowed to travel in or without outside of the country while you're here. So just another caveat, we typically do J1 visas for foreigners.
There's a question about staying with the companies that people work with at externship. That does happen from time to time. The externship can be seen as a sort of a prolonged interview, if you will. And for people who are looking for the next phase of their career, if they have an idea of where they want to be, we can certainly try and put them in an externship And again, if that goes well, we certainly have seen on a regular basis that they will go on to work for those companies, venture firms, startups, whatever the externship may be. The typical post-career path of fellows, I think it's highly variable. I think one thing we did a recent, and you can look this up, there's a paper we wrote about 4 years ago on the outcomes of our fellows. What is pretty true is that people who come to our program end up working in health technology. About 98% of our graduates still have a career that involves health technology. But what people do is variable, often based on their background. A lot of clinicians will go back primarily to clinical roles, but they'll have so many more tools and networking abilities to innovate that they, on paper, may look like clinicians, but are often heavily involved in technology development. For our engineers, business people, and other backgrounds, there's a real potpourri of opportunities, from going on to the investment side, from working at startups, from taking your own project forward, getting it funded and turning it into a startup, to working at a mid to large cap company. Sandy, anything else from your experience that you want to touch on there?
No, I think that there's a broad base of opportunities, and it's really up to you as a fellow on how you want to take that forward. We do offer a significant amount of mentorship and advice while you're here with regards to next steps in your career and potential areas to explore. And so that's a very common way that the externship is used, as a way to both trial a next career step and potentially, as James said, to interview for your next step role. And I don't think we're not expecting fellows to go in any one way in particular. It's definitely focused on what your career goals are and where you want to take your career forward.
Great. I see a really good question here. Physician who's wondering if their background matters to the fellowship, meaning their specific medical background or medical specialty. The answer is absolutely not. In fact, we think the value of the program, particularly for physicians, is that you come in and learn how to innovate in a different specialty than your own. So as a pediatric surgeon or general surgeon, when I came to the program, I was put into plastics and regenerative medicine. Our physicians this year, we did ophthalmology, and not one of them was an ophthalmologist. So the point, again, is to teach a repeatable process of innovation. And for physicians, we think it's even more valuable for you to learn how you can go about innovating in not your area, where you have biases and beliefs that are based on, potentially years and years of experience in the field, but you can be quite narrow-minded in your own field because people just do it the same way over and over. So learning how to innovate in a different specialty of medicine, we think, is really valuable. There's been a few more questions about kind of a postdoc. Do you need experience? The answer is we do look for some level of experience. So straight out of school is something that we'll look at, but we do prefer people to have some experience. You don't have to have a doctorate degree to apply, and that's a great question. We do call it, quote, a postdoc fellowship, because that's how we manage it. But no, any degree with experience is really open for application. What startups coming out of biodesign would you consider the biggest success stories? We've had quite a few. There's been 2 companies that have gone public recently and quite a few acquisitions. So if you're looking at financial returns, those would certainly fit that bill. Specifically iRhythm and Shockwave you can look at. Those are publicly traded companies now. iRhythm was started in around 2006, as was Shockwave actually, so they do take some time. iRhythm is a great example of a medical device combined with software and solving logistical solutions for physicians and patients. And it really was taking heart monitoring and turning it into a system that's a wearable patch that can be delivered by the primary care doc instead of a cardiology appointment, and then have a cardiologist review it and provide a diagnostic result that's as good, if not better, than what was the standard of care at the time. And so you can see, back to the original one of the original questions on hardware versus software. Some of our successes do involve software, not just from projects, but all the way to companies that have gone on to be very successful. And in terms of touching patients, iRhythm's probably touched the most because it's mature. There's been some recent acquisitions. I mentioned CL and some others, really in a broad range of areas. CL was a company run by our assistant director and co-director, which was addressing ventilator-associated pneumonias. And that's a real kind of a device-based solution. We've also had some companies such as Lully, which is successfully selling now. It's been a little bit outside of healthcare regulation where they're doing sleep terrors. So the list goes on and on, but hopefully that gives you a taste of what the projects have in terms of success stories. There's also been some that frankly have failed, and that's okay too. We try and teach a process that allows you to understand barriers early, to try and de-risk those things with the least capital, time, and effort as possible. I shouldn't say time and effort, but the least of your valuable time spent on a project. If you can take on a risk early, take it on. And if it fails, and that's okay.
Hey, James, as we come to, we've got about 15 minutes left and we still have quite a list of questions. Let me call out a couple that might be worth talking about. One is, if a company comes out of the program, what's the ownership stake between the founders and the university? So I think just addressing intellectual property in particular would be, there's another one around who owns the idea or a solution. So maybe talking a little bit about intellectual property, and then another question around housing, moving to the area, and what resources the fellowship makes available to help incoming fellows find where they're going to live.
Great. Well, let's touch on the IP one first. That's certainly a great question. As a paid employee of Stanford, as a postdoc fellow, then you do assign your IP rights to Stanford, as do we as faculty members. So the IP generated during the fellowship is owned by Stanford. That does not give Stanford any right to ownership of any company that comes out of it. So they're really two separate issues. There's IP, and then there's company ownership. So IP Stanford owns, that can be a good or bad thing. We generally think it's a good thing, especially for early stage projects. The university has a strong Office of Technology Licensing that can help navigate early issues around determining patentability, writing patents, and paying the upfront costs of doing so. If and when you want to move your IP out, and there's royalties involved, the university splits the royalties three ways. A third of the royalties go to the inventors, a third goes to the department in which it was invented, and a third goes to the university. And that's a standard policy that's not really up for discussion. Our Stanford in general has a very pro-inventor policy of licensing. So if there's a group of inventors that want to move forward versus a large company that wants to license, the university will often go with the inventors who really have motivation, drive, and knowledge of the project. So while some people think that that's onerous, we actually see a lot of benefits in having Stanford own that IP. In terms of company ownership, that's a completely different issue. Stanford doesn't have any rights to the company, with a minor exception that your IP agreement, you can give them some portion of the company as a payment instead of capital, but that's really only a small amount. In terms of founding the company, that's something that comes up with each group that comes out of biodesign. We have, as with everything we do, we have guidelines and advice that we can give you and industry mentors that you can speak with. But it's really up to the founding team to determine how they divide the, quote, founder's equity or the founder's pie. So when a project first comes out, it's really 100% owned by the people who start it, and they need to come to an agreement on who owns what percentage and what percentage can be divvied up further on down the road. So I hope that answers that question. And then on to I've already forgotten the second one, Sandy.
It was around housing and housing resources and just what advice and what kinds of things do we provide with regards to finding housing in the area?
I can take that one if you'd like, James.
Yes, go ahead, Emily, please, thank you.
Sure. So yeah, we do send out an email with several links to help you find housing. It is your responsibility as a fellow to find your own housing. We don't arrange that for you, but we do provide you with several resources. Fellows are not eligible for on-campus housing, but there are several Stanford affiliated complexes around the area that you are able to get into if you put your name on the list early enough. So we try to get you set up as best we can with the resources you need. Also, the outgoing fellows are a great resource if they're leaving place. Some have been roommates together, and we have an extensive alumni network that it will be there to help you, and you can always send out requests for housing that way. So it hasn't been a problem in the past, and we try to take care of you as best we can. So.
Let's see. Another one to throw at you, James, would be, again, it kind of comes to experience. There was a question on the other end, which is more than 5 years of experience considered a negative? And I would say, look, I came in with 7 years of work experience from a company that I was at. I think that there's no upper end on it at all when it comes to work experience. But we are looking for is, again, that drive and that determination and that motivation to be working on innovation related projects. And so clearly the longer you've been in the workforce the more potential projects you have to demonstrate. But we are, again, we're looking for a specific profile of a person, not necessarily a laundry list of everything you've done. We want to see that you are highly motivated, that you are excited and focused on innovation, and that you are really going to make the most of the time that you have here at Stanford.
Great, thanks, Andy. I've got kind of 3 up here that are all pretty logistical, so I think we can get through these quickly. One is, will the disease state be told to us ahead of application? The answer is no, as we're still finalizing that work. And our philosophy is that, again, we're teaching you a repeatable process. So we don't want people applying just based on the disease state that they're interested in. We actually really prefer to push you into, an open disease state to really kind of open your mind, be willing to learn how to innovate that in that area, and then have that as a repeatable process you can take forward. So the disease state is not something that we have available, unfortunately. In terms of the timeline for team formation for someone who joined late, the teams are formed the first week of the fellowship. We sort of draft team formation based on what we believe experience and skill sets are. We then spend the first week getting to know the fellows, and within that first week, we have the teams put together. One note on teams is that the team you start with, you're expected to go through to the final presentation of the project in April or May. But given that this is a real world experience, teams don't always stay together and teams can reform. So once your team has finished the final presentation of the project, in terms of deciding who goes forward on that team is really up to the team. They can bring in other people. Certain members may not want to go forward, etc. And we can help navigate that. And that's, again, where it's an educational process, but it's a real project. And when there's real opportunity, we have to deal with it as a real world kind of startup situation. That parlays into a question onto funding for the project. Within the fellowship, we have a small amount of prototyping budget, a few $1,000s that's the team can use for prototyping. There's potentially additional funds in that range available if needed. But in terms of really funding a company after the program, we believe that it's really on the group and the project to find that funding. There is an interim funding program called the Summer Extension, which funds on the between $20,000 and $100,000 for projects and can allow them to spend a few more months within Stanford de-risking 1 or 2 key aspects of the project. But beyond that, to really start a full company for commercialization that would, is likely to require on the order of millions of dollars, we have the network to connect, but that's not something that we primarily do. We kind of end the educational program with summer extension, getting projects to a mature state, and then we expect people to go out to the real world and be able to raise funds if the project has merit.
Hey, James, there's one I think you should answer here that says, do healthcare providers need to have specialized before they apply to the program, or can residents apply? Do you want to speak to surgical residents versus other people in other forms and locations of their clinical training?
Yeah, so for clinicians, over the last few years, we've generally taken people who are either in the middle of a residency. They don't have to have specialized yet, but they do have some experience as being physicians, as residents, or just at the end of residency. Within the US, there's a lot of residency programs that offer 1 or 2 years of research as part of that. So there's many surgical fellowships across the different specialties of surgery that offer a year of research. There's often medical or specialty medical training that offers that. That tends to be a good time for clinicians. But again, the specific time for clinicians is really when it's best for them, once they've typically started residency or just completed it.
Do you want to talk about the acceptance rate? So typically, what's the acceptance rate? How many applications we get? And that's some information.
That one's on the Q&A page, but we typically get somewhere in the range of about 150 to 200 applications. We interview about 30 people, and we offer 12 positions. So that's 3 teams of 4 that ultimately come to Biodesign. I can't do that math off the top of my head, but I'm sure so the acceptance rate is probably about 8 to 10%.
There's a question here about, have you had scientists rather than engineers come in as fellows? So biologists, chemists, biotechnologists. I would be one of them. I have a PhD in biophysics. I am not an engineer by training by any means, but I certainly did learn how to come up with more mechanical solutions after my time at Biodesign. Again, it's really about creativity and your ability to innovate and to be able to read and scan clinical literature and integrate that into the kinds of solutions and insights that you're driving in the program. So no, there's no particular request that someone be a specifically like a mechanical engineer. You can have a pretty broad set of either scientific or engineering background in order to apply and be a relevant candidate.
Great. And I think I'll take just one last one here because we're coming up on the hour. The question is very specific, but I'll kind of broaden the answer. It asks what AI resources are available. And of course, AI is hot right now, but other things have been hot over the years. I think the answer to that question is Stanford is your resource, and Stanford has an incredible amount of intellectual capacity. There's people obviously who are experts in AI. We don't directly teach any one solution skill set, but we do have access to an incredible network of people. So if AI is a good solution for you, there's nothing like a postdoc sending an email to someone else at Stanford and saying, hey, can you help me think this through? So whether it's AI, data and analytics, mobile application, or frankly, modern, sensors, imaging, all kinds of technologies are being developed and worked on campus. Those resources are generally an email away to get some initial answers and find people who you can work with. And that's really part of the innovation process, which I'll end on, is that, again, we talk about motivation and desire to do this. Again, by making this a real world project, there's no specific answer to what you should do here. You should learn the process and find ways to move things forward. Use the network, the resources, the experience that's here, and then understand how to leverage all those things, as would be an example of finding an AI expert, to be able to push something forward to ultimately impact healthcare. So with that, I want to thank Sandy and Emily for joining us on this. And if there's any follow-up, we certainly have an FAQ page that's available on the website that people can take a look at. It does touch on some of the issues that were asked today. And within the invite to the webinar was email address that you can address specific questions to. So again, thanks to everyone, and I think we'll sign off.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.